can't think of any more human activity than conducting science experiments.
The game I play is a very interesting one. It's imagination in a tight straitjacket.
The beauty of a living thing is not the atoms that go into it, but the way those atoms are put together.
What I always think should be the basis of education is not answers, but questions. We should teach kids how to question.
Welcome to Blabcoats. My name is Amit Siddiqui. In this abridged episode, Meow talks about why he's so passionate about the democratization of science. To listen to the full episode, go to blabcoats.com and subscribe to our podcast. You know, having talked to you for a bit, the democratization of science seems to be something you're very passionate about.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Yeah, so I think I had a friend, one of my dad's mates, who was a partner in Ernst & Young, and he said to me, I said, why do they have to make, I was like working at Macca's at the time, earning $4.60 an hour or something, $4.92 it was, as a 15-year-old. And I said, you know, it just really sucks. I wish they paid us more money. And he said to me, it's good to pay people low money when they're young because it increases their ability to stay at school. If you make it too appealing for them to leave, they won't do it. And then I thought that was kind of interesting. I thought on that for a long time about, is it fair to pay people less than what they're worth? And sometimes it is, right? Sometimes it's not. And then that combined, that kind of led my economic thinking for a while, thinking about poverty and how do we create these cycles and stuff. And then when I was at uni, I had another conversation with him, and he said, being poor at uni is good because it's character building, and the best thing we can kind of do is actually take people from rich backgrounds and make everyone live a uni life, which for me was working a part-time job, struggling to pay rent, because most of my money was spent on beer. So I'm eating rice, eating vitamin C tablets, drinking beer, living close to uni with ocean views in a tiny shoebox apartment, but it actually worked out cheaper for me to live in a place with ocean views. So it's like, you know, it's like this real kind of crazy thing about being at uni and then working part-time in a board game store, having heaps of fun, but also struggling to like balance work life, you know, and school all together. So it was really character building, right?
Yeah.
But I wish that everybody had that same thing. Mm-hmm. And the democratization is basically creating equitable outcomes. So no matter whether you're rich or poor, you can still access BioFoundry. And I might charge you differently. If you can afford it, I'm more than happy to ask for more money or accept more money. But we're not going to turn people away because they're poor. So I think that's the democratization. The other thing is engaging with technologies that democratize it as well. So when I think about this, we say lowering the technological and cost barrier to studying science. So that's things like showing people ways to access journals that might be behind paywalls.
What do you mean behind? Oh, like as in...
So yeah, using services like Sci-Hub, where you can go on and you can access any journal. I ethically don't agree with people charging for papers.
Right.
So
especially if it's government funded, taxpayer.
Government funding now says in Australia that if you're more than 20% government funded, you have to publish in an open access journal. Yes. I don't even agree in open access journals.
Really?
Yeah. I believe in places like Archive and BioArchive.
Can you, what are those?
Yeah. So they're basically, they just check the formatting and make sure that there's nothing crazy in there. Right. Like no perpetual motion machines or anything. And then they publish it, and then the peer review is every person that reads the paper. It doesn't get taken down either, generally. So the good thing is it actually forces you to employ your critical thinking skills.
It's like open science.
Yeah, it is. So I'm interested in solutions like that. Like, why the fuck do we need journal publishers? Like, they don't do anything. And they're the only ones that get paid in the whole process. The people who do the peer review, the people who do the research pay for the privilege, right? Like that's factored into grants.
For the research as well.
Yeah. This is it, right? So and it's just nonsense. Like, how does this industry exist? Like, they're taking everyone along for a ride, and it's like, well, you know, when was the last time you saw a maths article published in a journal. You don't.
Right.
They don't publish in journals. You know why?
Why?
Because everyone's a peer. Everyone that reviews the paper, anyone that can understand it can tell you whether it's right or wrong.
So
because it's logic, right? It's a formal logic. So like it either is
right.
or it isn't, and no one publishes something that isn't, and they publish they publish everything open access by themselves. They don't need someone to peer review it. They don't need someone to say, "Oh, now give us $1,500 and we'll make it available to the public for $35 a go."
Yeah.
You know, they just publish on Archive, ARXIV, right?
Right. I think that see, even going back to the democratization of science, the established academia, you know, going through these journals, giving them $2,000 or $1,500 to publish research that you've conducted, and somehow they're going to profit off that through their subscriptions. I think that's ridiculous. And again, that, you know, there's a barrier to people who want to conduct science, and it's fascinating, you know, open access and open science, and the ones that you mentioned, they're moving away from that model.
I might also add in there, it also changes the way that science funding goes and the way that scientific experiments are done.
How so?
Because metrics used by academics are heavily tied into journals. So you have things like H indexes and citations and things like this. So you have like people start designing their grants and experiments so that they can advance their career. So scientists, for anyone who isn't aware, scientists' career progresses not through the amount of money they bring in necessarily, but how revered they are as a scientist, and that's generally indicated by how often they publish and how highly cited they are by other scientists. So what the respect kind of is in these metrics. The thing is, though, there's a lot of bullshit around this. You know, a bad paper can get referenced as much as a good paper. Right. So there's inbuilt buffers and things to try and measure this out. But you only progress in your scientific career through publishing.
Right.
And there's different metrics to work out how that is. So sometimes people might say things like, "Oh, I'm going to publish as much shit quality research as I can," and they'll do things like minimum publishable research, because if they can turn one good paper into 3 average papers, it might actually advance their career, increase their ability to get funding. So journals are responsible for a lot of problems we have in science, and we can fix this by going back to another system that rewards quality over quantity. There's efforts to change this in the scientific community, and we were talking a bit about public funding for science. There are public metrics starting to come in. So not just like journal citations, but how many times this is talked about in social media, how many times it's shared. And this really changes metrics around, because like it starts to say, okay, well, if it's publicly funded, maybe it should be in what the public is interested in. Right. So there's some changes happening. And I think that, like, you know, journals are like the Blockbuster of science. They're like on the way out.
The video easies of science.
That's it. I can't wait. And the good thing about this is, even if a paper's wrong, like take Seralini's anti-GMO paper that got retracted, right?
Yes.
The best thing that these papers can do is actually be wrong, because it generates critical thinking.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest challenge. It's not even science education. It's just getting people to switch their fucking brains on for 2 seconds. You know, without critical thinking, you get people doing research without any filters. And that's when you get conspiracy theories. It's when you get, you know, anti-GMO, anti-vaccines. It's not research. It's research without critical thinking. And good on these people for at least looking and reading.
Yeah.
But the problem is, how do you discriminate what's right and wrong? And that's a skill you're taught at university.
Right. So so, you know, even with the peer-reviewed papers that we have, you know, there might be a paper that's not well understood, and people, like, this happens a lot with climate change, and Potholler54, who's got a YouTube channel, deals with this very well, where people misconstrue, they take things the wrong way, and this comes back to not developing critical thinking. But do you think that there's going to be a propensity or a tendency to have misunderstandings when we publish this sort of research out in the open? Look, peer review, I think, has issues. I mean, you have people who are reviewing your research who aren't even experts sometimes in the field. You'll get chiropractors reviewing something in, like, medicine or whatever, you know?
Yeah.
And that leads to issues. But do you think there'd be other issues popping up where you might get a surge, maybe initially even a surge of, like, the pseudoscience interpretation of the research, and eventually people will learn and figure it out?
There's also, like, just going back to that peer review stuff as well, there are fields that are so small, there's 3 people in the world that do it.
Yeah.
And if someone gets published, it actually might limit their chance to get grants. So there's all these biases in there. And I speak to scientists all the time that tell me these crazy stories about this. But yeah, there's already pseudoscience being published, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
So, and also in ways that are more accessible. So we'd think about the traditional journal format, but I think what will happen is the journal format will break down a little bit. So we'll see... if you read Watson and Crick's original paper on discovering the double helical structure of DNA, it's tiny. This thing's like not even a page long. On the discovery of the double helical structure of DNA. If that was discovered today, there'd be fucking 1,500, 3,000 words in Nature, and it's easy to read. There's no obfuscation. I think we're going to move back to this. I referenced a paper in my honours from 1899, and it started with gentlemen. That's the first line. But I actually kind of like this conversation between people finding things that are interesting.
Yeah.
And this is what blog posts are. This is what Facebook conversations and posts are. So the biohackers, we're always talking online, right? Posting graphs. Sebastian was posting spectral data of his halogen lamp that's in his house, saying, why is there a dip at 600 nanometers? And we're having these conversations. We're discovering stuff. This is traditionally how science was done.
Yeah.
Science is obfuscated when you read it. If you try and read a Nature article, Nature's pretty good. The jargon and the density of information is so high that it means the ordinary person, even some scientists, even if you read a scientific journal outside your field, you can't understand it.
Yeah.
And there's no need for that. It's scientific hubris. It's professors eating their own shit, right? Eating their own bullshit, saying, look how smart I am. And anyone that tells you otherwise is lying. That they say, oh, I'm going to say it the right way or anything like this. There's no reason why you couldn't make that accessible to the public. Or someone educate. So say, for example, if someone from the social sciences was to read one of my scientific papers, they should be able to understand it. There's no reason why someone in a different field or discipline that's as educated as I am shouldn't be able to understand what I'm doing, right?
I totally agree with you. And that's something I think Richard Feynman was very a big proponent. He hated jargon. He was very aware of, the jargon, but also the conventions that each field had. He was very critical of that. But going back to this peer review, do you think it'd be something like Netflix where you get stars on publications, and you get there's a bar that tells you, so many people reported this as being bullshit, and so many people like this. Do you see a future?
I actually see something even more complex than this, but I'm working on a project which is looking at dismantling the journal industry. And I can't tell you guys just yet. I'll do a deal. You can come back and interview us once.
Yeah, for sure. We would love to do that.
So,
okay, let's.
But just broadly, there's emerging technologies that allow us to do stuff like this that are simple to program, easy to use, deliver value to everyone. If you think about it much longer than that, you'll work out exactly what I'm trying to do. So yeah, it's not hard. Journalism is fucking prime for disruption. Sometimes you see these industries and you're just Uber with taxis. Even though Uber wasn't really disruptive, they're just there's so many problems facing this industry. We can come in, solve all the problems in one go.
Yeah.
And when you see things like that, they're too tantalizing. You have to go for it.
Fair enough. Thanks for listening to Blab Codes. Rate and review our podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast, because it does help us spread the word. And if you like what we're doing here, then help us grow it by sharing this with a friend of a friend, or your mailman, even your mailman's mailman. We also want to hear from you, so send us questions or comments to blabcodes@gmail.com. And if you have any interesting questions or comments, then we'll talk about it on air.